I'm Amy Till, Programme Director at NLA, and on behalf of the whole team, I'd like to thank you for joining us, both here and in the room and on the virtual platform. We've got an action-packed 2 days for you, where we will be discussing what makes our cities resilient, and we'll be unpicking what it really means to be socially, environmentally, and economically sustainable. This forum really embodies what we're about at NLA, bringing people together to shape better cities for everyone. And I'd like to say a massive thank you to all of our partners and supporters for sticking with us throughout this challenging year and helping us to shape a brilliant programme. So now I will hand over to Professor Greg Clark and the panel to kick off our opening session. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning from me. To anyone who's travelled outside of London, a big welcome to you, and thank you very much, everyone, for being here today. We have both a physical audience here today from the 1,500 registered delegates. Welcome to you, and thank you for being here with us. We have about another 500 who are joining us online digitally, so good morning to all of them. Our first session has a stellar panel. Sitting next to me on my right, Mayor Andy Street, the Mayor of the West Midlands. Sitting next to him, Councillor Rachel Robertson, the leader of Westminster City Council. And in the building, but not yet on the stage, joining us very shortly, is Councillor Susan Aitken, the leader of the City of Glasgow. Please give a big welcome to our panel, if you will. Now, the way this conversation will work is that I'll take the privilege to ask a couple of questions of our distinguished panel, and then I'll be inviting you to submit your questions. There are two ways to do that. Firstly, using Slido in the Slido app, and you can see in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen the registration for Slido for this event. Please do take the time to get into Slido, because we'll use Slido both for some polls, which I'll mention in detail in a minute, but also we'll use Slido for you to send your questions and to preference each other's questions. So if somebody comes up with a question that everybody likes, we'll ask our distinguished panel to discuss that one first, etc. So it's a prioritization mechanism as well. I'll also be inviting you during the course of the morning to do some hands up at various times, and we'll practice that in a minute. But firstly, let me then say to my colleagues, please launch the Slido polls now. There'll be 3 questions that you'll be asked, and we'll look at the answers to those questions a little bit later on in the discussion. Let's also practice the hands-up approach, if we may, and I've got 2 questions for you. Firstly, I want to know, is this your first, second, or more than second large audience event since the pandemic started? For those of you for whom this is your first large audience event, please raise your hands. Thank you very much. Wow. For those of you who've done 2 to 5, raise your hands. Okay, there's some seasoned people there. And those of you who've done more than 5 large audience events, please raise your hand. Okay, a few of you. So welcome to all of you. More than half of the room, I think, attending its very first event. Now, we're going to be talking a lot about resilient cities this morning. A very simple and general question. Do you think our cities are now more or less resilient since the pandemic? If you think they're more resilient, please raise your hands. Okay. If you think they're less resilient, please raise your hands. Okay, so I'd say that's about 90 plays 10. People think that they're less resilient than more resilient. Okay, let's get straight into the discussion. I'm going to ask our panelists 2 questions, and the first one is, how has the pandemic revealed the resilience and the vulnerability of our cities? And I'm going to ask Andy to begin.
Okay, Greg, thank you very much, and great to be here. Now, there's something illogical in what's just happened, because I put my hand up saying our cities are probably less resilient, but I'm now going to give you 3 reasons why the opposite is true, and then just 1 to support that argument. So clearly, I can't count. Right, so resilience. I think there's 3 things that we've seen that have been perhaps somewhat surprising to say, actually, the resilience has been revealed. And of course, the first is the resilience of the residential property market. The stories were full a year ago that we were all going to flee to the countryside, that the sort of surge in city centre living would be reversed, and actually what we're seeing in the West Midlands is exactly the opposite of that. To quote an estate agent in Birmingham last week, I haven't got any properties that I can offer to somebody moving in on a corporate relocation. So the market has been incredibly robust. So the obvious question is, why is that? And I think actually it does make sense when you think about it, that actually people want to live in sustainable communities. So actually the notion of being very close to work in quality accommodation has actually proven the winning way forward. So perhaps an irony from what we thought 12 months ago. The second sustainable piece is, of course, that our cities aren't just the city centres, and it's the suburbs. And there's been something of a suburban renaissance, and you see that. I'll be honest, particularly in the affluent suburbs rather than the more challenged suburbs, where the whole notion of, the jargon is the 15-minute city, but the whole notion of shopping locally, working locally, travelling locally, that is clearly in the ascendant, and that is being reflected in some controversial planning decisions that are being taken forward. And of course then the last part that is perhaps the most surprising, because just 12 months ago we were all talking about the death of the office. That has not proven the case, and I know there's one or two key property developers from Birmingham and the West Midlands in the room, and actually what we've seen is incredible resilience in rental prices for Grade A offices in the city centre, commitment to many new schemes. I know that Argent are in the room, and if you look at the story of Paradise, you look at the story of Snow Hill in Birmingham, it is an incredibly positive story with new occupiers coming in and giving confidence to the market. So obviously the question is, why is that going on? And of course I think the answer is very apparent to us, that it is maybe not about people working 5 days a week in the office, but there is a general perception now that at least a mixed model and what you can do uniquely in the office that you can't do at home is going to win through. And of course the whole notion of the city centre being the focal point of social activities and indeed the public transport focal point has really helped in that piece. So surprisingly, some of the doom mongers of last summer have not come to pass.
Great, Andy, thank you so much. And, I was up in Birmingham just a week ago, and the vitality of the city centre is very palpable. So completely connect with what you say. Rachel, let's come to you if we may. The question is, how has the pandemic revealed both the resilience and the vulnerabilities of our cities?
Thank you. Well, I'd agree with much of what Andy said, but I think there's also a distinction to be made here between inner cities and the outer parts of the city. So speaking as the leader of Westminster, right in the heart of London, unfortunately we've seen the vulnerabilities, and we continue to see the vulnerabilities of inner city areas to this. And there's a number of reasons for that. So for example, if I talk about Westminster, we've got a resident population of 250,000, but pre-pandemic, over 1 million would then come in on a daily basis. 1 million people come in on a daily basis to work in the centre, but also to visit the centre, to visit the nightlife as tourists, etc. So our vulnerability is quite clear in that, with more working from home and also with international tourism very slow to pick up and people more concerned about what they see as congested inner city areas in this environment, then clearly that's had an impact. And in Westminster, our average footfall is still less than 50% of pre-pandemic. In some of the outer London boroughs, you're seeing footfall levels back up to where they were before. So there's a clear difference in terms of what's happening between inner city areas and outer, which are more dependent on perhaps a workforce and tourists alongside the residential bit, which, as Andy said, has been very resilient. And in the outer areas, those have actually benefited, if anything, because more people have been working from home, so that supported, those high streets, those hospitality areas. The other big thing that for us in the centre of London, but I think it's true for any city centre, is the importance of public transport. And one of the things that has come out time and again when I've been talking to people is, we're fine when we come back in. We understand all the things that you've done to make the pavements temporarily wider so we can move around. We're fine when we get into our office, but we're really nervous about getting on public transport. We're really nervous about the tube, about overland trains, about the bus. And so that's a real issue because, you can't go back to a situation where everyone's driving into the city. It's simply not practical, particularly at the moment when they can't get any petrol. But it's also, it's not a practical way forward. So confidence in public transport, how people move around, how that connectivity is really, really important. But going back to the point about resilience, I think the other thing I would say about cities, and we do need to, you know, for us in the centre of cities, we do need to rethink how this working from home is going to look, how our office space is going to look. And similar to what Andy's saying, actually, we're seeing in Westminster quite a lot of demand for office space, but it's coming from different areas. So we need to understand what that is, what that shape of that is, and support those newer industries, newer ways of working. But we also need to be really clear about what our USP is. You know, so it's all the other things that people would come into the centre for. So they're not just coming in to work, but people do like being together, the innovation, the creativity. Look at everyone gathered here today to exchange ideas and buzz off each other. But it's also talking about the culture, the heritage, the other things that people come in for. And of course, cities can pivot quickly. So, you know, with the expansion of alfresco dining, bringing everything out onto the streets, that's been something that we've been able to do quite quickly.
Yes, it's been interesting, Rachel, hasn't it? What a reminder it's been that the magnetism of the city is not just about it being a place to work.
Exactly.
It's also about it, you know, being a stage for fun. Ladies and gents, let's give a very warm London welcome, if we may, to Councillor Susan Aitken, the leader of Glasgow. Susan, we apologise that you didn't get a proper guide from the front door to the stage.
The apologies are all mine. No. I'm sure I'm not the first person to have got lost trying to find the entrance to the Barbican from the tube, but this has to be the day on which I managed to do it, so my apologies.
And I'm sure your parents knew that you were always destined to be on stage in the Barbican, and that this would be the chance to. Susan, we've already heard from Andy and Rachel on the first question. How has the pandemic revealed both the vulnerabilities and the resilience of our cities? What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, I think some real similarities with what both Andy and Rachel have said, but particularly in the Glasgow context. Glasgow is the city centre that has been, outside of London, most affected in terms of the drop in footfall and is slow to return, undoubtedly. Glasgow city centre has a low residential population. Historically, Glasgow was deurbanised and depopulated. Now, looking back, bizarre policy choice back in the 60s and 70s, which has resonances still. And we have been trying to repopulate our city centre in recent years. Before the pandemic, we had a city centre residential strategy, which was really starting to bear fruit. All that the pandemic has revealed for us is that is so important, that we need to accelerate that, we need to move faster with that, because having a city centre population and that vibrancy in your city centre and not relying on people either coming into work in offices or to shop, but on a much more mixed city centre economy, rather than your city centre or even parts of your city centre being for one thing. That's a vulnerability that has really been revealed for us. And the shift in policy has been shown to be the right one, but hadn't started early enough to get us to where we need to be. But certainly now we understand that having people in our city centre for all sorts of different reasons, and ideally having them permanently living, working, playing, doing everything in the city centre, is the key to resilience for the long term. The good thing is, although we are being slow to return, I sense a lot of confidence that when Glasgow comes back, we really will come back. And there are some existing players, big players, in retail, but also in development, in residential particularly, but also in office, who are demonstrating real votes of confidence in Glasgow. Obviously Glasgow is Scotland's biggest city and Scotland's only metropolitan city, the biggest by quite some distance. Our partner city, our rival and friend in Edinburgh, is always in a very different position. Edinburgh is Edinburgh. Edinburgh has a gorgeous castle sitting right in the middle of it. They've never had to try too hard, to be perfectly honest. And Edinburgh will return. They're pretty confident. They've got no problems. But in Glasgow, we know we always have to work that little bit harder. And one of the things I think that's demonstrated for me, what's incredibly important is that we have and had already established a partnership ecosystem between the city, represented in the council as the democratic leadership with that convening power within the city, but our business community, whole range of sectors, key figures in that, our 5 universities and 3 colleges, key national agencies like Skills Development Scotland, Scottish Enterprise, the Scottish TUC, for example. A few emails and phone calls got us round the virtual table early on, and developing the Glasgow Economic Recovery Group, developing an action plan, which we got underway, very city centre focused. The Glasgow City Centre is, and obviously we say all the time, and rightly, that cities are the drivers of innovation, of economic growth, of modernity. The modern world is made and will always be remade in cities. But in Glasgow City Centre, before the pandemic, there were 170,000 jobs, and that's not counting supply chain. Now, to put that in context, the discussion around the transition of the oil and gas sector in the northeast of Scotland, around about Aberdeen, the position there is around 65,000 jobs. Now, very important jobs, but it gives you a sense of what a unique economic space Glasgow City Centre is. There is no other greater concentration of economic activity in Scotland. So the return of Glasgow City Centre is not just for Glasgow, and it's not just for our surrounding local authorities in the metropolitan area. It is of absolutely national significance for the whole of Scotland. And I'm glad to say Scottish Government has responded very well to that. We've established a city centre task force. Scottish Government are attending regularly, as are national agencies. And after quite a bit of nagging from me, I have to say, the government have also established a kind of mirror national city centres task force in which all 7 of Scotland's cities are represented. So in some ways, I think that focus on cities in an urban policy in a way that perhaps hasn't happened in Scotland in the past has been a good thing, and will be a lasting thing to come out of this. The realisation that we can't take our cities for granted. We can't take our city centres for granted. Resilience won't just happen. We have to work and plan to build resilience into cities and think about what actually makes that resilience. And ultimately is people and people's behaviour. But we need to create the frameworks, the urban space to allow them to make our cities vibrant and resilient and to build in that inclusive growth.
Susan, I'm going to just stop you there, if I may, because you're starting to answer the next question.
Okay.
But thank you very much for that. And there's a lot in what you say about how the city centre needs to reinvent itself. And I've heard this summarised as city centres getting out of consumption, commuters and corporates and getting into innovation, habitat and experience more as, and in Australia recently they produced a report saying from the central business district to the central experience district. It's quite an interesting way of thinking about it. Rachel, let's come to the second question if we may, and then when we come back to Susan, we'll ask you for a word on how you're feeling about COP26 and what the atmosphere is like in the city. But the second question is, what's then the role for place, for property and the built environment in the future resilience of our cities? What's the role for the built environment in particular in making our cities more resilient as we go forward?
Well, I think it's absolutely central. And we always knew that, but I think the last 18 months, almost 2 years, has really underlined that even more. So we did a survey, a national survey recently about the West End, and the great news was that there was really high perceptions about the West End, people really wanting to come back to the West End, really keen to come from all over the country. They understand what's on offer there, they know the attractions, etc., etc. But when we asked them what are the things that we could do to improve the West End, there was nothing about the offer. There was nothing about, more culture, more anything else. It was all about the built environment and the public realm. It was all about how do we move around more easily, how do we make the spaces more attractive, how do we address overcrowding. It was all built environment and public realm, and we know that. And as Susan was just saying, we need to make these ensure that we're making these attractive places for people to come. We need to address air quality. We need to address all of those things that make the city centres attractive places to just be and visit, as well as the things that are on offer there. So as well as the workplaces, as well as the wonderful hospitality, as well as the theatres, all of those things, we've got to make them attractive and easy places for people to visit. So for us in local government, in national government as well, I think and indeed working in partnership with the real estate world, it's a really important lesson for us around that issue. I think it's also really relevant how we build homes, the sort of sustainable homes that we build. So, for example, I have to put in a plug here about what we're doing locally, but we're developing an estate, regenerating an estate, actually on the edge of Belgravia, so it is possible anywhere, where we had currently 360 homes, we're building 781, but the point is the development will have 90% less carbon, it will pay back its carbon footprint in 12 years. And that's really important. It's important for our cities, it's important for the people who live there. But we need to be working in partnership with all of our developers, our great estates, looking at how we all push the boundary even further in terms of sustainable development. I mean, I could talk a lot about what we're doing locally. I think all cities are. But this is really important, and it's really important now because it's showing that we have to make the actual place attractive as well as the offer if we're going to encourage people to come back in and spend time in our cities.
Great, Rachel, couldn't be clearer. Thank you very much. Andy, your views about this. What's the role of place, property, the wider built environment in the urban resilience of the future?
Yeah, okay. So, obvious answer, it's vast. So, I use Birmingham as the sort of exemplar in the first contribution I make. I want to go to Coventry to answer this question, actually, because I think the regeneration of Coventry city centre shows three of the themes that are going to lie behind this answer. So, I don't know if people in the room have been to Coventry recently, but you will see a city that is literally transforming itself before people's eyes. And it's a middle-sized city. And of course, so far, we've been having a conversation which is very much focused on Glasgow, London and Birmingham, the three biggest cities by population. So it's interesting to take a middle-sized city. The big redevelopment of the city centre that is next coming, called City Centre South, summary, it knocks down 40% of the retail core and provides it with a new anchor, which is a performance-based space. So fascinating what is now considered to be the centrepiece of a regeneration. And obviously the concentration of retail that's come on the promise of this coming has actually strengthened that. The other thing that has already happened has been an incredible investment in public realm before City of Culture, and you can just see Coventrians and visitors taking pride in that public space that's been provided. And then the third ingredient of it for middle-sized cities is real quality residential, and that, of course, is something we've seen in the biggest cities, but we've often not seen it in the next tier of cities. So interesting how that is coming. And then the last ingredient in Coventry's regeneration will be our own urban transport, sustainable green transport coming there, which again has often not been done in middle-sized cities by taking a lower cost approach to a light tram system. So I would tip people to have a look over the next few years at how Coventry, in a sense, becomes an exemplar by taking a number of those themes. Genuinely really exciting. And by the way, we're looking for a funding partner to be part of that. So offers, please, on a postcard. And you won't go wrong. Interestingly, though, all backed by a very vibrant economy. So there is a very important point that you can do this much easier if the economic fundamentals are strong as they are in Coventry. But the second point I just want to touch on very quickly is actually less strong economies and the contribution of brownfield remediation. Obviously, the opposite of resilience is fragmentation, dereliction that you see in some areas. And I honestly think in this whole debate about sustainability, protecting the green belt, really forcing through public funding brownfield regeneration in some of our toughest areas, particularly in the Black Country, is absolutely critical. We are successful in securing funding from central government over that, but I would honestly say the combination of that and moving towards net zero in some of those regeneration schemes, forcing modern methods of construction, forcing net zero through the terms that we use for the public funding is another critical new angle around this.
Andy, thank you very much indeed. I mean, you've underlined a point that Rachel also made, which is the link between attractive, sustainable, reliable transport and the decarbonisation and, as it were, reanimation of the city centre. I think that's a very interesting theme that we might pick up in the questions in a minute. And people in the audience, thank you for the questions you're sending. Please send more, and don't forget to vote for the questions that you see there so that we know which ones you're most interested in. Susan, coming back to you then, the theme is urban resilience. The question is, what's the role of property, place and the built environment in the future resilience of Glasgow?
They're absolutely central to it. I think if we didn't know already, we've really learned that the quality of place and the buildings that make up places, the buildings and the environment around them, are absolutely central to resilience. They're also absolutely central to well-being. And I think if we didn't know already, what we know now is that what people want and what people need from us is cities and urban places that create health and create well-being, add value to people's well-being. Places are never just places. They are part and parcel of the quality of life, and also of life opportunities for people as well. And Glasgow is a city where we have learned that lesson the hard way in previous decades. So I agree entirely with everything that Rachel and Andy have said. The quality of urban realm, space, shifting from traffic, particularly private traffic, to space for people. And in Glasgow, our programme in that is called Spaces for People. The pavement widening, the creation of pop-up bike lanes, the pedestrianisation that's happening across the city centre and out in our neighbourhoods as well. The quality and mixed housing. As we repopulate our city centre, we're very conscious that where other cities have done that, there has been that danger that newly hip places to live, newly popular places to live, can become too expensive for ordinary citizens in a city to be part of. So there must always be mixed tenure housing where people of different backgrounds and different income levels have the ability to live together and to share space. That's also part of the healthy society that we need to build, and that is a resilient society. Those things go together. For us, the working with the property sector has really helped to drive this forward. New models for housing, so mid-market rent is becoming really important for Glasgow, build-to-rent models as well. I know more established in England, but new in Scotland, and we have led the way in Glasgow and are really driving forward with that, looking at co-living models for students. Essentially, there isn't, in a diverse population like ours, there isn't a housing need that doesn't exist, so we shouldn't be scared to try a housing model that responds to those different needs, to pioneer and to try out new ways of living and giving people every opportunity and all the options that they require to be part of the city, to live in the city, to make the city part of their life, and vice versa. And all of that builds in the resilience. But quality, and particularly quality in terms of environmental sustainability and health, public health, the two of those go absolutely hand in hand. I think they're indivisible. And property and the quality of property is absolutely central to the future of that.
Great, Susan, thank you very much. And you're making that connection between property and public health, I think, in a very important way that's very nuanced here. Now, we've got lots of questions have come in. We've got just under 12 minutes. It might be a little bit quick fire, if that's okay, panelists. So, Rachel, the most popular question was asked of you. You can guess what it's about, I suspect. You've mentioned the success of alfresco dining, and yet you're ending it in most of the visible locations in Soho tomorrow. What's the rationale behind that?
Well, I'm delighted to be able to put this one straight because we're not ending it. So what we said is alfresco, which has been hugely important for our city because we managed to create 16,000 extra spaces through the pandemic, 16,000 extra servings, if you like, on our streets, and that's helped hospitality businesses to survive through this time. But most of them, in an inner city area like Westminster, most of them have relied on temporary barriers and also temporary road closures. And what we were very clear about, we made the commitment a while ago, was that we would consult with our local residents in each of the areas and ask them, were they happy for it to continue? Because clearly this has an impact on those areas as well. I'm delighted to say that in all of the areas that we consulted, and I'll come back to Soho in a minute, in all of the areas, they've come back with a resounding, yes, please, continue. So they're not finishing. St John's Wood, Belgravia, Mayfair, all of these ones, we've consulted with the residents and they've said, yes, we think this really helps our area. We really like this. There may need to be a few tweaks here and there, but they've been really resounding successes. But it was important for us to consult. The one that is more difficult is Soho, because the only way that we could deliver Soho was by doing a lot of temporary road closures. And that obviously has an impact for not only the residents, but for other businesses there. We have theatres, we have a lot of other businesses there, which also need to get around. So what we've said in Soho is that, yes, we will take out the temporary barriers and lift the road closures at the end of September, but we have already launched a process, Debbie, who's here in the audience, is leading this, where we are working with the residents and local businesses in Soho to co-create how we can deliver an alfresco scheme for Soho. So it might not be, and London Fire Brigade have already told us that we need to address some of these issues. It's unlikely to be to the extent that it has been, because that would entail significant road closures, which isn't practical going forward. But we accept that it's been a really positive thing for Soho, and we want to explore how we can extend that.
Great, thank you very much. So that's put the record straight on that one. Andy, there's a question that's come up here. 24 people have voted for it. Has COVID shown us that cars are not compatible with the resilient city?
No, it hasn't. Because anyone who thinks that every journey in a city can be made by public transport, cycle or walking is wrong. It's shown us that we have to have the right mix of public transport and cars still being used for certain journeys. So my approach to this is to maximise the investment in green public transport. And I'm sorry if this sounds a bit indulgent, but it's worth just drawing out with the London audience. London investment in public transport 7 times what it was in the West Midlands per head of population. We were about the same as the rest of the country. We're steadily closing that gap. We have to do more of that. And of course, we have to also spend money on cycling and walking routes, as we are. But if you look at local sustainable neighbourhoods, or you look at some journeys to work, we still need the car in the city. So actually, it's about the two coexisting together. The really encouraging thing, if you look at Birmingham, though, the share of journeys taken by car for commuting was falling well before the pandemic, and I believe once we get back to normal attitudes about confidence in the use of public transport, that will continue. But it is a real issue, not just in London, around the country, this question of getting public transport to be the majority part of the recovery.
And I guess, Andy, if I may, that part of the interest of the West Midlands here is also leading the charge on electric vehicles. Is that a part of your agenda?
That's a slightly different subject, but absolutely it's related. Not all cars are equally bad. So obviously, if we can move to green technology around cars, electric vehicles, then that in one sense deals with the pollution aspects. It doesn't deal with the congestion aspects, remember. And it certainly doesn't deal with the health benefits of using sustainable transport as well. But critically, the West Midlands is well positioned to lead the electric car change. Of course, Birmingham and the West Midlands has always been the centre of the automotive industry in the UK. About 50% of automotive R&D occurs within 20 miles of Birmingham city centre. The next stage of this is actually to make sure that the big battery factory, yes, there's one in Nissan in Sunderland, brilliant, but actually that industry focused around the West Midlands is critical to us competing with Germany and France and the US and China in this new technology.
Great, Andy, thank you very much indeed. Susan, there are 2 questions for you. I'm going to encourage you to be brief if you don't mind. In a couple of words, how are you feeling about COP and hosting the world in less than just over a month's time?
I'm excited and very nervous and not getting a lot of sleep. It's a phenomenal opportunity. It is a platform that we will never have again in my lifetime in the city, certainly. We are determined to maximise the opportunity. We published our green print for investment just last week, a massive shift in the kind of infrastructure investment from what would ordinarily for a city of Glasgow's size be investments, perhaps traditional property investments in the tens of millions. We're moving into the tens of billions, hoping to announce by the end of the year, along in partnership very much with the Scottish Government, that the Scottish Government's next strategic transport projects review will include a commitment to a metro system for the Glasgow metropolitan region, a 10, 20-year even investment in modern decarbonised connectivity right across the city. We are looking at £9 billion to retrofit 450,000 homes across the Glasgow city region. I think COP26 will be the COP of cities in a way that previous COPs haven't been. It's absolutely clear, and it is, again, it's indivisible from what we're talking about today. A resilient future city is a decarbonised city, and a decarbonised planet needs decarbonised cities first and foremost, and actually in the next decade. Nation states are not going to get anywhere near their targets if they don't invest and support cities to lead the way in decarbonising. That will be a big theme in COP26. And there is, on the 11th of November, Cities, Regions and the Built Environment Theme Day at COP. So that's the one for this audience, perhaps in particular, to look out for the discussions that come out of that.
Great, Susan. We can't wait, I think, is probably the message. Now, there's a more nuanced question here. You spoke about the reduction, as it were, of footfall in the city centre being a possible impact of this, and the desire to get a bigger residential community in the city centre. Are there other ways in which you're helping the transition, particularly for retailers who are going to lose footfall? How is that going to transition in Socky Hall Street and in other parts of Glasgow?
As other leaders have said, is that investment in quality of public realm is what the public sector can do. What councils can do is literally change the streets to make those streets more attractive, to make people want to stay there, to come for a variety of reasons, whether it's to shop or to do other things. Glasgow has a couple of what you might call urban malls, I suppose, under roofs in the city centre, and we're working very closely with the owners of those who are both looking, and this gives me optimism and confidence for the return of Glasgow city centre. They're both looking to majorly redevelop. I think the assumption was in the past that in a rainy city like Glasgow, people would always want a roof over their heads to shop. But the opposite is now true, and the retailers are saying they want to face the world. They want to face the street. And so we're turning those inside out, if you like, and what is indoors is coming back outdoors again. That is the future of retail. I think that distinctiveness is the future of city centres as well. Of course, we will always need those big anchor players in the retail market, and we want to keep those in our city centres and support them as much as possible. But they need to be alongside something that people think they're not going to find anywhere else. As each individual city works to develop that, I think that's going to be a really important part of our future offer.
Thank you very much, Susan. We've just got a couple of minutes left. I want to quickly look at the results of the poll that you took, if you don't mind. Could we look at the poll results? They're not up there, but the first question was, do we know more, less, or about the same about how to make cities resilient since the pandemic? 92% said we know more, which is interesting. Can we see the next poll, please? I'm looking at them on my screen. So what's been the most impressive aspect of city resilience from your point of view? Nearly half the room said it was changing the road space to make more room for active travel and hospitality. The next one was the increase in neighbourliness, community networks and social capital. And then a lot of people said all of the above. And then can we see the third one, please? The question here was, how different will the post-pandemic city be in, say, 5 years' time? And they were asked, is it going to be very different, somewhat similar, or very similar, somewhat different? Just over 60% said that. We've just got time for a couple of very quick questions. And Rachel, there was a question about, are you going to do something specific to help retailers who now need to, as it were, compete with online retailers more? And Andy, there's a question about whether you think Birmingham and the West Midlands are part of the solution to London's chronic housing problem. Maybe you two would like to comment on that briefly, and then we'll close the panel if we may.
Two things. First of all, we are lobbying very hard that an online sales tax should be brought in, which would also critically give some relief on business rates for our physical high streets. It's absolutely critical to create a level playing field so that our physical high streets can compete against online retailers, but also it comes back to how we make sure that the public realm, but also the overall environment for physical retail is as much as it can be. We've also done, as well as that, we've also done a lot around voids and pop-ups in voids, so that we're animating that space and creating really attractive environments, and I think that's going to be really important as well. So it's all about the experience, encouraging people to come back to actually enjoy the experience of shopping as opposed to just shopping online.
Great, thank you very much. And Andy?
The answer is yes. And in a sense, it doesn't matter what I think. What matters is what young Londoners think about this. So one statistic that will make you reflect on this. Pre-pandemic, look at where young Londoners are choosing to move to. 19,000 in the year 2019 moved to the West Midlands, 10,000 to Manchester, 8,000 to Leeds. Birmingham had a positive net movement with London. That's the first time that's occurred for many, many years. So actually, Londoners are choosing that. It relies on two things, though. Relies on a strong economy in the West Midlands. People don't do that if they can't see the job opportunities, and we're in a good position over that pre-pandemic. And of course, it also relies on the quality of the accommodation at a good price, which is in your hands. But there's no question, the market is pushing that, never mind the political agenda.
Great. Well, I could talk with these three wonderful people for another hour, but I'm afraid we don't have another hour. So I'm going to ask you to join me in thanking Councillor Susan Aiken, Councillor Rachel Robertson, and Mayor Andy Street. Thank you very much indeed. Plenty more sessions for you to enjoy today. That's the end of our first session. We look forward to seeing you over the next 2 days. Thank you very much.